Thank you.
Welcome, welcome. Good afternoon. So we're gonna dive right in on this beautiful New Hampshire afternoon. My name is Lynn Chalette, and I'm the executive director here at the New Hampshire Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. And we are so happy to have you with us this afternoon, Senator Bennet. Thanks for joining. This is part of our bipartisan series of conversations with presidential candidates on crime victim rights and issues affecting victims of sexual assault, domestic violence, stalking, and human trafficking. The Coalition is an umbrella organization for 13 community-based crisis centers here in New Hampshire that each year provide free and confidential services to approximately 15,000 survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence. On a statewide level, we also engage in systems change, policy advocacy, and communications, and supporting our member programs, who we're happy are represented here this afternoon as well. We're a nonpartisan organization, and we don't endorse presidential candidates, but we do believe very strongly in the value of dialogue with elected officials as well as with the public about issues that affect victims every day. So knowing your deep commitment to education, we are very excited to have a conversation today about one of the areas in which we believe we can do the most to prevent violence, to respond appropriately, and to create safe learning environments for students. So we've brought together a distinguished panel for you this afternoon. Going around, this is Jennifer Tevetter, who is our prevention coordinator here at the Coalition. Erica Skoglund is a prevention educator at Haven, which is one of our member programs. Anna Goebel is a young activist and upstander and a true inspiration to all of us. And John Gabrielli is doing some exciting policy work that he's going to share with you this afternoon. So to start, we thought we'd turn it over to you to welcome folks and talk about your vision for safe learning environments.
And I thank you very much for having me with you. And I would say this, the best job I think I'll ever have was being superintendent of Denver Public Schools, which was a school district that's got, it's 95,000 kids, most of whom are kids of color, most of whom are kids living in poverty. And when I first became superintendent, we were dead last in terms of student growth of any school district in the state of Colorado. Now, 15 years later, Stanford just did a study that reports that the kids in Denver are growing so much faster than the kids in the rest of the state academically that it's as if they have 60 additional school days a year, which on a 180-day school calendar is not nothing. And it's a reminder that we don't have to accept the outcomes that we see for so many kids living in poverty in this country. There are many, many things that affect kids' ability to learn. You know, homelessness affects their ability to learn. Whether they've eaten affects their ability to learn. Whether they have access to good guidance counselors or not affects their ability to learn. And obviously, violence in all kinds affects their ability to learn, and domestic and sexual violence in particular. And I will say, just by way of introduction, you know, at a time when we've seen what we've seen in the entertainment industry in America, we're grappling in real time with how to think about this with respect to the Department of Defense and what it looks like to have a way for people to report what's happened to them or to other people in ways that encourages them to be able to report and doesn't end their career at the same time, doesn't create more trauma, doesn't value a culture of confidentiality over a culture of making sure that we're dealing with the underlying problems. I can tell you every single one of those things is an issue in our public school systems, and we have not yet come to grips with it in a very effective way. And that's why I'm here today. I actually want to learn from you. I'd like to hear how you're thinking about this, and any contribution I can make to the conversation I'd like to be able to make.
Wonderful. Well, we appreciate you being here. So we thought a great way to start would be to give you a little bit of a sense of the landscape here in New Hampshire and what actually happens on the local level. And so we've invited Erica to join us today to tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing with children in the school system and how you think schools and communities are responding to Haven's effort to provide education in a respectful way about relationships and about consent, and particularly the nature of the work that you do across the age spectrum, which I think is one of the exciting and really innovative things that Haven does.
Great. So I'm really happy to be here. My colleagues today are in a school right now teaching 8th graders.
As they should be.
Yeah, a second part of a 3-part series, our care series, and they're teaching kids today about consent. And so we're lucky enough that we have 4 full-time educators who go to schools. We're in schools like 4 to 5 days a week, depending, starting in September, running all the way till June. We see kids K through 12. We go classroom by classroom because that's the best way to do it, is right there with a small group of kids rather than an auditorium style presentation. And with the little guys, kindergarten through 4th grade, we use puppets to teach them their safety rules, their body safety, and teach them about talking to a trusted grown-up if there's anything that's making them confused, hurt, or scared. We teach them my body belongs to me, and it's really well received. The kids love us coming in. They love the puppets. It's really fun. It's really funny, and it's also really, really important. And we know that it works because we hear about kids. All the time we have advocates that go to our child advocacy centers whenever a child is interviewed, and advocates will come back and tell us that children are there and have said, you know, I came, you know, I told someone because a puppet said that I could talk to someone about what was going on. We hear that constantly. So we know, you know, we're received really well with that. With the middle school, our middle school stuff, we do all kinds of different programs that build on what we taught them when they were little. So we do stuff on sexual harassment, we do stuff on images in the media, we do stuff on dating violence, on sexual violence, on victim blaming, on consent, all kind of building on each other. And our programs get longer. We do try to do multi-day sessions because we know that that's way more effective if you can see the same kids for multiple days and year after year. We are received super well in all of our programs. Last year we saw about 14,000 students in and teachers in Rockingham and Stratford County, which sounds really impressive, but there are about 40,000 kids in our catchment area, so we know we're missing
Of that
a lot.
age or of the?
In school age kids, yeah. And we, you know, all 4 of us are working nonstop to see who we see. We don't do any marketing, we don't do any advertising. This is all just repeat schools or word of mouth if someone moves to a different school. And then it's like, why isn't Haven here? And we smush them in if we can. So what we really need is just, you know, unrestricted funds that allow us to put money toward getting more educators, that allow us to build our capacity, and that allow us to kind of do a program that's unique to the needs of our different schools, because we know that a one-size-fits-all program doesn't work for all the different populations that we see. You know, we really just need to be able to continue to go to the schools that we already go to, and then to add those kids that we're missing. We want to expand so that we can start at preschool, because we know it's never too early to get these body safety messages out. And you know, just like other safety rules, just like fire safety, you have the firefighters come every year to remind kids these messages. You know, we need to be in the schools every year reminding kids about safety messages. You know, everybody knows like stop, drop, and roll,
Right.
but people don't regularly catch on fire. But like little kids need to know about my body belongs to me, because that's something that unfortunately we know it's way more likely for a child to be affected by this kind of thing than to catch on fire.
That's for sure.
So yeah, so we just need to keep doing what we're doing it more and more often.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you, Erica. So I'm glad, Senator, that you mentioned reporting in your introduction, because we as a coalition and our member programs believe that the way that individuals and institutions respond when someone comes forward is absolutely critical. If we advance the message that Erica's sharing, that a child should come forward or a teenager should come forward when something happens, it's incumbent upon all of us to meet that report with the respect that it deserves. So we're happy to welcome Anna this afternoon to talk about her experience. When she was just 13 years old, she spoke up about inappropriate behavior that she witnessed between a teacher and a student. So Anna, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about what happened and how you ended up here today as the advocate that you are.
Do you mind if I ask how old you are now?
I'm 17. So when I spoke up about inappropriate behavior I witnessed by my middle school teacher, I was suspended for 3 days because it was seen as spreading gossip. And not only did I face retaliation from the teacher I tried to report, but I also faced retaliation from students who loved him and colleagues who loved him. And when I moved up to the high school, the teacher I tried to report and the principal who suspended me also moved up to the high school. And I carried so much guilt with me because of my suspension and because I thought I was wrong. And it didn't help when I would see my principal in the hallway or my teacher in the hallway. And this past April, it was discovered that the teacher I had concerns about was arrested for sexually assaulting students while still being employed by the school. So when I found out my instincts were correct, my family and I, through legal action, had my suspension removed, and also required district-wide training to recognize the signs of grooming by teachers and anyone else. And I also shared my story to the Concord Monitor, our local paper, and I spoke at the coalition's event to try to raise awareness about the importance of bystander intervention. And once the community here found out about my suspension and how this teacher's behavior could have been prevented years ago, there was outrage. And the community really wanted the principal and the superintendent involved in my suspension to be removed. And the superintendent and principal did resign about a month ago. And we have anonymous tip boxes at my school and online forums. And we're starting, my school community is definitely starting to get used to reporting and starting to feel safe with adults at the school, but it's definitely getting there. There's a lot more we need to do. But it's just the beginning. I mean, we do have tip boxes, but we do need to work on it a little more about reporting and the importance of reporting. Thank you.
So may I ask you a question?
Absolutely.
So first of all, thank you for your advocacy. It makes a huge difference in it, and as you can see, even if it takes a little bit of time. So thank you for what you're doing and for sticking with it. I'd be interested to know how you think the culture of the school has changed a little bit more about that. When you think about the issues as issues that are between two students versus between a faculty member and a student, those things introduce different dynamics that you're thinking about or worrying about, or how you're approaching that kind of stuff.
I mean, when the students found out that I was suspended for trying to speak up about the behavior I witnessed, people were scared to speak up, and people were worried that they were going to get in trouble. And a lot of people, not only me, but other students were, they were like, I don't want to get in trouble. I saw that happen to Anna, so I want that to happen to me. And now that my principal has resigned, I feel like a lot of people are starting to get more comfortable, but it's with reporting, since we do have anonymous tip boxes. But I mean, it's a scary thing because, you think you're doing the right thing, and we're all taught, see something, say something, but it's a little hard to do that when you could potentially get in trouble.
Thank you,
Thank
Anna.
Thank you.
Anna has certainly inspired all of us in so many capacities to keep moving, and I think it's interesting how you describe the tip boxes, and we know that's a great first response, and we also know, as you pointed out, there's a lot more that can be done. So I'd love to turn it to Jennifer on our staff, because Jennifer has just a wonderful kind of breadth of experience of what's happening around the state in kindergarten through 12. And also, I'm hoping you can share some insights in terms of what you see as best practices right now for schools to do exactly what the Senator asked, change their environment, but also change their policies and change the way communities can be involved in those responses.
Yes, absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Senator, for your commitment and dedication to making schools safer places. We know that that is incredibly crucial, and that it is challenging for schools due to all of their other responsibilities they have. But if we don't stop and make sure that children are in a safe environment where they are receiving all of the necessities and basic needs that they need, they won't be ready to learn. So we need to make sure first that kids are safe and healthy so that we can actually increase the academic outcomes. But there's a lot to it, and especially if we look at some of the changes that need to be done, starting with Anna's story, that if we're silencing students' voices, if we're making kids feel like they can't ask for help, we are actually setting up that entire community to be vulnerable to perpetration, right? Because we are advertising that we don't listen to reports, and that is definitely not what we should be doing. We need to be changing the policies and protocols, but starting with schools who have had incidences, we need to start by listening to the community, hearing the voices of their students as to if they feel like they can come forward about reports or issues or questions on these topics. And the school needs to not only listen, but make a commitment to really rectify the errors and make change to their policies and their practices as well. Because you can have the best policy you want, but if you don't have buy-in from the administrators, if you don't have the full commitment from all the educators and full training, and that they don't make a commitment to survivors and their student safety, we're not going, those policies don't mean anything. With regards to those policies, we currently are looking at making some template policies so that we can help our member programs when they're working with schools to really make sure that they are encouraging best practice. But it's so much more than, as we mentioned before, so much more than just that policy piece. And it's not only policy around sexual violence prevention or sexual harassment, but on all different levels. So as you mentioned before, Senator, there are so many different adverse childhood experiences that children are exposed to: hunger, poverty, street violence, violence within their home, exposure to domestic violence, child sexual abuse, all sorts of things. And those exposures to adverse childhood experiences can sometimes translate into seeing problem behavior in students. And if those are being met with punitive means as opposed to actually coming in and trying to help the student, we're not doing anybody any, we're not making a difference. So what we need to do is readdress the way that we refocus and reshape the way that we address these issues to make sure that students who are having struggles and exposed to unsafe environments are getting help and support, and look at expanding the protective factors that we have in place for them. And really being able to, first off, identify those warning signs. So if a student is showing signs of possibly being exposed to violence, the teachers need to be able to recognize this, because we know that most students don't report voluntarily. So we need to be able to identify those. We have some wonderful campaigns going on in New Hampshire right now that we collaborate with, the Know and Tell campaign, which goes and teaches about mandated reporting and recognizing the signs of child abuse. And we also need to work on really bringing it down to the teachers as well. So each teacher needs to be able to recognize these signs and know how to take a disclosure. We also would like parents to be involved in trainings, and we can incorporate preventative parenting strategies so that students are able to use anatomically correct language and are able to know from the beginning what is and is not appropriate touch, so that if something happens to them, they're able to ask for help. Because sometimes we hear from survivors of child sexual abuse, they didn't know that it wasn't normal. And if we are continuing this taboo, this blanket of taboo over this topic, we are just cloaking the abuse that is happening to children. There's so much more as well, and I don't want to go on too long and over speak during my time, but we really also would like to see this movement listen to the voices of minors. Anna is incredibly brave and has been an amazing advocate and activist on this topic, and we know that there are more around the state, but we need to help elevate those voices and really listen to them, because all too often children are silenced, and we don't really seem to want to take the time to understand the challenges of the youth today. But we know that there is such an extensive reach now through the internet, and children are exposed to so much more. Perpetrators are able to get into their phones, into their homes through cyber technology, and we need to do more to protect them. Also, sexual harassment. It's not, students aren't able to just leave school and have a break from it, but we see Facebook or Snapchat and Instagram being used as means to further harass individuals. So media literacy is so important.
I was just gonna ask Erica, if you don't mind, about that. Is that also part of what you're doing? Do you guys talk about, what kids might find on social media and what, or
We do, a little bit in some
media
of our,
literacy is the way you described it, yeah.
we have our program for 7th graders is a 2-part presentation that's about images in the media, and we talk a lot about stereotypes that they might see, and just about critically thinking about the things that are around them and the advertising that they're seeing, and kind of the messages that they get about relationships or about violence, or about sexual violence. and how that is kind of normalized sometimes in ads
Yeah.
or seen as a joke, and how joking about that can affect victims, and so that's a big part of what we talk about.
And have you noticed, Jennifer, as you've gone around the state, whether, in thinking about the testimony that Anna gave today and is talking about whether, is there developing a set of uniform protocols of some kind that says, this is how these kinds of matters should be handled? In other words, we're having a big debate right now in the Senate about how to, as I mentioned earlier, how we do this at the Defense Department, because there are a lot of people that are concerned that if it's in the chain of command, that the commanding officer is the one that has to decide whether the person is credible who's brought the complaint forward, that creates a whole bunch of issues. I actually happen to believe that. There are others who think about it differently, and they're not here today, so I won't. But I think we have exactly the analogous problem in schools as we do in the Defense Department. I'm no longer a school superintendent, thank goodness, so I don't have the answer for that. But I wonder whether you're seeing districts responding to that. Like, it's one thing to just get rid of the principal and the teacher, but okay, so what happens when this happens the next time?
Right, and that's why we want schools to really commit to a holistic public health approach, which is policy change, but also protocol response. So we are trying to help create ways in which we can ensure that schools are first off Title IX compliant, which K through 12 schools are required to be, but unfortunately we're seeing that many are not, or most are not. And really, within New Hampshire, every district and every school has their own unique approach, and we don't have as much of a centralized, unified approach, but really trying to meet each community where they're at and work individually and independently with that school community. But again, through template policies, which we're working on developing right now, bringing other experts to the table to make sure that we have the New Hampshire state mandates incorporated in that, as well as the federal guidance that we are making sure is inclusive, and going beyond also the requirements. So New Hampshire has, in 2016, we expanded our state mandate to include that sexual violence prevention programming is required in schools for all students, but again, that looks different on for each community, town by town and school by school. But our prevention educators do an amazing job bringing this into their communities the way that they need it to be. And we are just trying to work on expanding those protocols and policy templates so that we can then cater them to the individual communities. But it is a school by school, town by town approach that we're currently utilizing.
And I think in our experience, every district is different in terms of their appetite to sort of incorporate these templates. And I think one of our goals is going to be to create this model, and then to really look for some communities that are ready to embrace it and really ready to embrace the change beyond, as you pointed out, just getting rid of one or two bad apples, but to really say, how do we change our whole structure, and how do we make the community part of that, including the youth who are in the schools? So our national partners who came to the table earlier this week were really excited because the kind of templates you're asking about don't exist yet in the K through 12 world. We see more of them in the college setting. We'll get to that in just a second, but there really is an absence of the really good models that we could help school districts implement. So we're excited to be doing that work, and excited that they're interested in coming to the table because they also want to see these templates out there. So let's move to the kind of college setting where we know that students are in particular especially vulnerable to sexual assault when they move into the campus setting. And we've seen a lot of change in the last several years happen on campuses around the country. And at the same time, we know that it's inconsistent. There are some campuses that are really advancing best practices and others that are maybe getting there a little more slowly. So we're excited about a collaboration. We're just getting ready to begin with John and Every Voice Coalition to really look at comprehensive changes that could happen on campuses. He's had some really successful advocacy in Massachusetts, and is going to be doing some great grassroots work here in New Hampshire. So I'm hoping you'll talk about that a little bit, John.
Thanks, Lynn, and thank you for having me here today as well. I'm really grateful for you and the coalition and the opportunity to work with you on this. And as I mentioned, when we first started this work in Massachusetts, there were 8 of us, 8 students in a dorm room, who cared about this issue as survivors at Harvard, who either had been impacted by sexual violence or who knew folks who'd been impacted and we didn't really know what to do. And our first ally in this work was the Massachusetts Coalition Against Domestic Assault and Sexual Violence, who were the first people to really take us seriously and listen to student voices. And being here in New Hampshire, it's the same thing here with the coalition, so thank you. I'm here to talk about today campus sexual violence on college campuses. We have a crisis in this country. The statistics are clear. 1 in 5 women and 1 in 16 men will be impacted by sexual violence on college campuses. And those statistics are even higher for students of color, for first generation students, for LGBTQ students, and for students with disabilities. Those statistics have also held for more than 40 years now. So as much as we feel like we've made progress, as much as we feel like the culture has started to shift, and it has, the statistics are as high in 2019 in the most recent data we've seen as they were in the 1970s when we first started collecting data on this, and I'm sure as they were for decades before that, before data started to be collected. We can't just accept this as the norm. There are 20 million college students in the United States. That means we're literally talking about millions of victims every single year who are not being served in many cases by the university systems and the legal systems that are supposed to bring justice. And we saw that firsthand in Massachusetts. We started this campaign in part because when we first started doing research about what was going on in our state, we saw that the majority of college campuses had reported the previous year 0 cases of rape or sexual assault on their campus. And that meant we knew people at those schools who had been impacted. That meant they didn't feel safe coming forward, they didn't feel protected in coming forward to tell their story, and they were not receiving the protections and the supports that they needed. And so that's what kind of called us to action in the first place. But it goes far beyond just reporting information. No student should ever be required to live in the same dorm or eat in the same dining hall as the person who assaulted them. That's still happening on college campuses. No student should be punished because they came forward to report a case of sexual violence. We have members of the coalition who were expelled from their school because, for example, they were drinking at the time of an assault, and the first question they got asked when they came forward to report was, were you drinking and what were you wearing? The type of same victim blaming assumptions that have carried on for decades, and so we can't just accept that as the norm. I think I have a friend who's a peer educator who, when she talks to classes of students, she'll say, what do you think the reaction would be if 1 in 5 students had their laptop stolen, or 1 in 16 students had their dorm room broken into? The college would be shut down. I mean, it would be a disaster. And yet, this isn't property we're talking about. This is people's lives. And so we've been pushing for 5 years now in Massachusetts for student-written and survivor-centered legislation that will address reporting, that will gather confidential survey data on the incidence rates of sexual violence, and will make that data public because students and families have a right to know, and because we need to gather data if we're going to really treat this as a public health issue. We've been working on confidential resource advising, so students have someone they can talk to who can help guide them through their options. We've been working on education and training, not just in K-12, but also in college, because there are still many students, even college students, that don't understand the definition of consent, that don't know how the reporting process works. And we've also been working on protection measures, anti-retaliation measures for students that do come forward to report, so they won't end up being punished. I think, I'll close with this. I think the urgency of acting right now is strong because, unfortunately, what we've seen is a federal government and the DeVos administration that is rolling back protections right now for survivors. And when you talk about student voice, we were one of 110,000 students and organizations who commented on Secretary DeVos's proposed changes of rolling back protections for survivors on campus, almost all of whom opposed the changes. We were one of 12 grassroots student and survivor organizations that requested a meeting with Secretary DeVos. She declined the meeting and instead opted to meet with men's rights activist groups, including one that's literally labeled as a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center. And ultimately, the decision is being made to roll back those protections. And so this is the time right now that states need to step up and ensure that just because the federal government is stepping back, our states are not going to lower the bar for survivors of sexual violence. And that's what we're working to try to make sure happens here in New Hampshire through student voice and student activism, because our generation is not going to sit around and continue to let this happen and see our friends and our family members be impacted.
John, can you explain something to me, something of my generation, which is, what is the political impulse that Betsy DeVos is responding to? I mean, I asked that, I mean, it just seems completely obscure to me, but you obviously know what it is, so.
Well, I mean, far be it from me to speak for Secretary DeVos, but I think what the administration would say would be that they are, trying to ensure that there's due process for, the accused, and of course we understand the importance of due process, but if you look at what's actually in the guidelines, most of it is actually narrowing the definition of sexual violence. So for example, assaults that happen off campus are no longer necessarily going to be under the purview of Title IX, for example, if you're studying abroad. Which again, that has no bearing on due process. That's just preventing students from being able to come forward and receive justice. And I think a large part of it, in my opinion, is that there are many great schools that are doing really important work on sexual violence, and we partner with many of them. There are some schools that still have the attitude of that this is not a problem here, we're going to continue to brush this under the rug, we don't have to deal with this, and they are concerned about lawsuits that they're facing under Title IX. And so they came and complained that the Obama administration guidelines were, putting them at risk for legal action. And so, part of those changes also are basically making it more difficult for survivors to come forward with Title IX claims.
Absolutely. Thank you, John. I think we're really inspired by the fact that the activism this group of students is engaging in is so comprehensive. The fact that you're looking at issues around reporting and services and systems change is so important. I think one of the other threads, and then we'll give you an opportunity if there's some questions you'd like to ask, Senator, that we so often see on the local level, the statewide level, and on the national level, is this incentive of institutions to protect their reputation at any cost. And if we are really going to have an honest conversation about what's happening to students in any setting, in elementary school, in community programs, in high school, in college, we have to be honest about what's happening, because that's the only way we'll get to solutions that are truly effective. So I think that's the opposition that I know we see a lot, is this, we're gonna protect our old school institution. This doesn't really happen here. So we have a few more minutes. Are there other questions, Senator, you'd like to ask of this wonderful panel?
I guess, Erica, I was gonna ask you, this is a very, well, it's not a small question, but it just occurred to me when you were talking. How often does a kid, when you guys go in, do you then hear a child who says, I didn't know that's what that was, and
it's hard. We don't have numbers,
Yeah.
unfortunately, and I've been trying really hard to get us, because we have advocates at the CAC, so we'll hear about it just anecdotally, but I've been trying to get them to actually, have the people who work at the Child Advocacy Center to write down, or somehow, because those numbers are pretty important to us to be able to show the direct line. But we, anecdotally, we hear about it all the time. And we also, the other great thing is we'll have kids in class who were affected by this already, who during our presentation, when the whole class is telling the puppet, you can talk to a grown-up you trust, it's okay, this isn't your fault. And we'll have kids raise their hand and say oh, this happened to me, and I talked to a grown-up, and it's okay for you, puppet, to talk to a grown-up. And so that's great, because we're seeing these kids who normally wouldn't feel okay about talking about this stuff, being wow, I did the right thing, I got help, and yay, look at me. And that's such a wonderful kind of extra benefit of what we do, is just letting those kids who've already dealt with this hear those great messages of this isn't your fault, you didn't do anything wrong, we believe you, we're listening, from their classmates and from, people who are coming into their class. And that happens all the time, where parents will be worried about a child sitting in because of their history, and then the child is yay, this is, I feel happy that, I'm it's really a nice thing.
And then maybe not, I don't know exactly the question is, I'll form it as I go, but Erica mentioned the need for unrestricted resources, and Jennifer mentioned that any program you have is only as good as its implementation, which is absolutely true. And we're living at a time when the institutions that you are all thinking about today, these schools, and many schools of higher ed, many K-12 schools, are really severely under-resourced and are under enormous, and even before you get to the issues of domestic sexual assault, we don't have the mental health providers, we don't have and I wonder is that conversation evolving in New Hampshire? Are people beginning to wonder why their schools are so poorly resourced, or are they accepting this as a permanent state of things?
I mean, I think
I
people
mean, this
are.
obviously asked for generalization.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, for us, we know that it's really important that we are training the kids and then also talking to the adults. Because if we're teaching kids that they should be, seeking out an adult that they trust if something's happened to them, and then the adults that they trust don't know what to say or say things that are really counter to what we want them to say, we're doing the kids a huge disservice. So for us, it's really important that we're training the whole community. But when we go to places, a lot of times when I do a parent presentation, people don't show up. When I want to do a staff training, the staff is like, we already know this, like, we're good. And they don't necessarily, they're like, just come in and train the kids, it's fine. We have a lot of schools who'll say, we can't have you in because we don't have the money to have you in, which we're always like, we ask for an honorarium, but we'll come in regardless of funds, regardless of what schools pay us or give us. But I know money is a huge issue, and time. When we try to get into high schools, our biggest thing is that they just don't have the time to have us come into the classes because they have so many other things that they need to prep for and standardized testing, and so they can't have us in. That's what we struggle with, I think, even more than funding, it's just time.
That's a resource too.
Yeah.
I would add on from the funding perspective, every state's gonna look a little bit different, but the crisis centers rely on a mix of federal and state funds. Here in New Hampshire, we do not get a penny to provide sexual assault services from our state government. So we're very dependent on a little bit of federal funding that is specifically directed to sexual assault, and the smallest area of that is what's directed to prevention. So what we believe is if we really wanna move upstream and reduce the number of kids that we're responding to who experience sexual violence, is we need to invest in a more meaningful way in prevention. The funding that we allocate to the member programs, it's unusual that Haven has 4 educators.
Yeah.
They have far and away the largest. We fund part of 1 educator at each crisis center around the state, and they're left to their own devices to raise the rest of the funds to support the prevention work. So really shifting that mindset to thinking about moving upstream is one of the partnerships we would love to see with any future administration, because I think we could really make a difference and reduce the number of students impacted by violence. Yeah, so we'll
Do
turn it
you
over.
guys have anything else to add to this? I'm sorry. I didn't mean
No,
to-
that's great.
No, I think everything that needs to be said has been said.
What grade are you in now?
I'm a
think
senior.
Senior, so do you know what you're doing next year?
I want to go to college. I'm not sure where yet, but I just finished applying, so I'll be attending some university next fall.
Good luck.
Thank you.
Are you still at school, John, or are you done?
No, I graduated in 2016, and we just kind of continued the advocacy and work on a volunteer basis because we want to see it through. And I guess the only thing that
Are you living here? Or
I live in Manchester,
Manchester.
yeah. And the only thing that I would add is, we have seen, and we were just talking about this before, we have seen such a transformation that for so long, these issues were often so stigmatized and people were afraid to speak up. And we've seen so many people have the courage to speak out. If you talk about Me Too, if you talk about, folks who are finally calling out things that are wrong, like Anna, and yet we haven't seen our systems and our structures transform to reflect that.
Right.
And so, they call sexual violence a silent epidemic. Well, people are speaking out now, and the question is, who's ready to listen and actually do something about it, so.
That's right.
And with Anna and John as exemplary examples of what our youth is like today, I think that I am actually feeling hopeful because we are seeing that this generation that's upcoming is kind and considerate and really cares about what's happening with their peers. I think that we are hearing that the students are ready for more programming. They want help in combating this, and the schools just really need to catch up, and the systems also need to catch up and change because they're ready for it. So we just need to make sure that we're giving them the tools that they need to really make the change happen.
Anything else, Erica?
No, I feel like I've said a lot.
Okay. Well, thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for joining us and
Great.
having this conversation. We believe the educational setting is such an important one where we can make such a difference in the lives of students.
Well, I agree with that, and I think that the problem that we face, there's so little that's being done now, and that you guys are on at the tip of the spear, and that's very, very important. And the opportunity for different states to learn from different states, for you to inform the federal government and our legislators what it is we need to be doing, And, you know, we've got a guy in office right now who says, I alone can fix it, that's why he ran for president. The reality is so different from that. If this democracy is actually gonna survive, it's gonna require all of us to step up and do what we need to do to fulfill our obligations as citizens, and that's what you're doing. And I've written that I think that we would all be better off if we thought of our kids that are in our schools not as future presidents of the United States, but as future founders of the United States who we need to put in the position of being able to fulfill their responsibility as citizens as well. We wouldn't have accepted for as long as we have the outcomes that we've seen for kids or the lack of responsiveness to the issues that we're here to talk about today. So I just want to thank the two of you for your leadership and inspiration. It means a lot to me that you're here and doing what you're doing, and I know it would mean a lot to the kids in the Denver Public Schools to know that you're here, so thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for
Thank
joining
you.
us today.
Thanks
We
for having
appreciate
me.
it very
Thanks,
much.
everybody.